17. Dated at Quebec, September 28, 1689. The author sets out from Missilimakinak to the colony and describes the country, rivers, and passes that he saw by the way. The Iroquois make a fatal incursion into the Island of Monreal. Fort Frontenac is abandoned. Count Frontenac is sent to Canada, and the Marquis of Denonville is recalled. Sir, I writ to you from Missilimakinak on the 28th of May. I left that place June the 8th and set out for Montreal, accompanied with 12 Ottawas, who were divided into 2 canoes and rowed very hard. The 23rd, I overtook the Coureurs de Bois in the river Creuse, who had got the start of me for some days. Mr. Dolhut used his utmost efforts to dissuade me from going further with so weak a retinue. He would have had me to go down along with him, and remonstrated to me that if my 12 conductors perceived either in the land carriage or upon the rivers anything that might call up an apprehension of falling into the hands of the Iroquois, they would desert me and the canoes and fly to the woods to avoid the enemy. I rejected his advice, though I had like to have repented of my resolution not long after, for according to his prediction, my canoemen threatened to run away to the forests at the fall called Long Saut, and indeed if they had done it, I had followed them, upon the reflection that of 2 evils a man ought to choose the least, but this storm blew over. In the great river of the Ottawas, not far from the river of Livre, I met Mr. de Saint Helene, at the head of a party of the Coureurs de Bois, who was bound for Hudson Bay in order to retake some forts that the English had seized upon. He acquainted me with the Prince of Orange's expedition for England, and gave me to understand that upon his arrival King James retired to France, and that the prince was proclaimed king, which seemed to presage a bloody and sharp war in Europe. I assure you, sir, this piece of news surprised me extremely, and notwithstanding that I had it from the mouth of a man whose word I rely very much upon, yet I had all the difficulty in the world to make myself believe that a revolution of such importance could be accomplished in so short a time without the effusion of blood, especially considering what a strict alliance there was between our court and the court of England, and how much 'twas the interest of both these monarchs to give mutual assistance to one another. July the 9th, I arrived at Montreal, after venturing down several fearful cataracts in the river of the Ottawas, and enduring the hardships of 15 or 20 land carriages, some of which are above a league in length. The navigation is pretty sure from Missilimakinak to the river de François, for in coasting along the Lake of Hurons we meet with an infinity of islands which serve for a shelter. But in going up that river there's some difficulty, for it has 5 cataracts which oblige us to turn out and carry all over land for 30, 50, and 100 paces. Having passed that river, we entered the lake of the Nepicerinis, from whence we are forced to transport our canoes and baggage 2 leagues over land, to another river which has 6 or 7 waterfalls that we commonly shoot. From that river we have another land carriage to the river Creuse, which falls with rapid currents into the great river of the Ottawas, near a place called Matawan. We continue our course upon this great river, till we come to the point of the Island of Monreal, where it is lost in the great river of St. Lawrence. These 2 rivers joined one another with very gentle streams, and quitting their fearful channels, formed the little lake of St. Louis. I thought to have lost my life at the fall, called the Fall of St. Louis, about 3 leagues from Montreal, for our canoe having overset in the eddy, I was carried by the current to the foot of that cataract, from whence the Chevalier de Vaudreuil dragged me out by a great chance. The canoes and the skins belonging to the 6 savages were lost, and one of the savages was drowned. This is the only time I was in danger through the whole course of my voyages. As soon as I landed here, I repaired with diligence to a tavern to refresh myself, and to make up the losses I had sustained by unnecessary abstinence. The next day I waited upon Mr. de Denonville and Mr. de Champigny, to whom I gave an account of my voyages, and withal gave in the news that a great company of the Coureurs de Bois and savages would arrive very speedily, which they did accordingly after 15 days. The rat, I mentioned above, came down hither, and returned home notwithstanding the threats that were levelled against him. By this adventure he showed that he laughed at their intrigues, but now that I have mentioned his name, I cannot forbear mentioning a malicious stratagem that this cunning savage made use of last year to prevent the conclusion of a peace between Mr. de Denonville and the Iroquois. This savage is the general and chief counselor of the Hurons. He is a man of 40 years of age and brave in his way. When he found himself pressed and importuned by Mr. de Denonville to enter into the alliance concluded in the year 1687 that I took notice of before, he at last complied with his desire, with this reserve, that the war should not be put to an end till the Iroquois were totally routed. This clause the governor promised to make good, and gave him assurances to that purpose on the 3rd of September in the same year, which happened about 2 days before I set out from Niagara upon my voyage to the Great Lakes. This savage general, relying upon Mr. de Denonville's promise, marched from Missilimakinak at the head of 100 warriors, as I insinuated in my 14th letter, in order to invade the Iroquois country and achieve some glorious feats among them. In the meantime, to carry on his design the more cautiously, he thought it proper to pass by the way of Fort Frontenac, where he might receive some intelligence. Upon his arrival at this fort, the governor told him that Mr. de Denonville was negotiating a peace with the 5 Iroquois nations, whose ambassadors and hostages he expected in a short time in order to conclude and ratify the peace, he having orders to conduct them to Monreal, and that upon that consideration 'twas most proper for him and his warriors to return home, and to pass no further. The savage general was mightily surprised with this unexpected piece of news, especially considering that by the means of that peace, he and his nation would be given up as a sacrifice for the welfare of the French. When the governor had made an end of his remonstrances, the rat acknowledged that what he offered was very reasonable, but withal that instead of following his advice, he would go and tarry for the Iroquois ambassadors and hostages at the cataracts, by which they were obliged to pass. He had not tarried there above 5 or 6 days before the unhappy deputies arrived with a train of 40 young men, who were all either killed or taken as they disembarked. The prisoners were no sooner fettered than this crafty general of the Hurons represented to him that the French governor had sent him notice to take up that post, in order to lie in wait for a party of 50 warriors that were to pass that way at a certain set time. The Iroquois, being much surprised with the apprehension of the persidiousness that he charged upon Mr. de Denonville, acquainted the rat with the design upon which they came. Upon that, the rat counterfeited a sort of rage and fury, and to play his cards the better, flew out in invectives against Mr. de Denonville, declaring that some time or other he would be revenged upon that governor for making him the instrument of the most barbarous treachery that ever was acted. Then he fixed his eyes upon all the prisoners, among whom was the chief ambassador called the Ganesorens, and spoke to this purpose: "Go, my brethren, though I am at war with you, yet I release you, and allow you to go home. 'Tis the governor of the French that put me upon this black action, which I shall never be able to digest unless your 5 nations revenge themselves and make their just reprisals." This was sufficient to convince the Iroquois of the sincerity of his words, and they assured him upon the spot that if he had a mind to make a separate peace, the 5 nations would agree to it. However, the rat, having lost 1 man in this adventure, kept an Iroquois slave to supply the place of the man he had lost. and after furnishing the prisoners with guns, powder, and ball in order to their return homeward, marched to Missilimakinak, where he presented the French governor with the slave that he brought off. The poor wretch was no sooner delivered than he was condemned to be shot, for at that time the French garrison did not know that Mr. de Denonville designed to clap up a peace with the Iroquois. The condemned prisoner gave an account of his adventure and that of the ambassadors, but the French thought that the fear of death made the fellow talk idly, and were confirmed in that thought by hearing the rat and his men say that he was lightheaded, insomuch that the poor fellow was put to death, notwithstanding all the reasons he could offer. The same day that he was shot, the rat called an old Iroquois slave that had served him a long while, and told him he had resolved to allow him the liberty of returning to his own country, and spending the rest of his days among his friends and countrymen. At the same time, he gave him to know that since he had been an eyewitness of the barbarous usage that his countrymen had met with from the French, notwithstanding what he offered in his own defense, it behoved him to acquaint his countrymen with the blackness of that action. The manumitted slave obeyed his orders so punctually that soon after the Iroquois made an incursion at a time when the governor did not dream of any such thing, for he had used the precaution of giving the Iroquois to understand that he disavowed of the rat's treachery, insomuch that he had a mind to have him hanged, and upon this prospect expected hourly 10 or 12 deputies to conclude the peace he so much desired. In effect, the deputies did come, but neither their number nor their design was suitable to what the governor had promised to himself. 1,200 warriors landed at the land's end of the Island of Monreal and burnt and sacked all the plantations in that quarter. They massacred men, women, and children, and Madame de Denonville, who was then at Montreal with her husband, did not think herself safe in that place. A general consternation was spread all about, for the barbarians were not above 3 leagues from Montreal. They burnt all the adjacent settlements and blocked up 2 forts. Mr. de Denonville sent out a detachment of 100 soldiers and 50 savages to oppose them, being unwilling to spare a greater number out of the city. But all the men of the detachment were either taken or cut in pieces, excepting 12 savages, 1 soldier who commanded the party and was carried off by the 12 savages after his thigh was broke. The other officers, namely the Sieurs de la Robert, Denis, Laplante, and Villeneuve, were all taken prisoners. In a word, the barbarians laid almost the whole island waste, and lost only 3 men, who, having drank to excess of the wine they found in the plantations, were decoyed into a fort by a Canadese cowkeeper that had been their slave for some years. As soon as the 3 unfortunate Iroquois arrived in the fort, they were thrown into a cellar to sleep themselves sober. And, questionless, as soon as they waked, they repented of their excessive drinking. When they waked, they fell immediately a singing, and when the garrison offered to fetter them and carry them to Montreal, they flew to some clubs that lay in the cellar, and made such a vigorous and brave defense that the garrison was forced to shoot them upon the spot. The cowkeeper being brought before Mr. de Denonville, he told him that the breach made by the rat's contrivance was irreparable, that the 5 Iroquois nations resented that adventure with so much warmth that 'twas impossible to dispose them to a peace in a short time, that they were so far from being angry with that Huron for what he did that they were willing to enter into a treaty with him, owning that he and his party had done nothing but what became a brave man and a good ally. Doubtless, this fatal incursion was a great surprisal to Mr. de Denonville, and afforded him a copious field for reflection. 'Twas already impossible to continue the possession of Fort Frontenac, where they began to want provisions, and which could not be relieved without exposing a great many men to the danger of the passes or cataracts, which I have mentioned so often. There was a downright necessity of calling out the garrison, and blowing up the fort, but the difficulty lay in finding a man to carry orders for that effect to the governor, for nobody durst undertake it, till the Sir Peter d'Arpentigny offered to go all alone through the forests, and accordingly he went, and did his business successfully. The orders were extreme welcome to Mr. de Valrennes, the governor of the fort for the time, who, upon the receiving of them, run a mine under the 4 bastions, which, with the powder he put in, was reckoned sufficient to blow it up. This done, he embarked and came down the river through the cataracts to Monreal, where he found Mr. de Denonville, and accompanied him hither. That officer did not only abdicate the fort of Frontenac, but set fire to 3 great barks that they used to ply with upon the lake, both to awe the Iroquois in time of war, and to convey commodities to them in time of peace. Mr. de Denonville acted a prudent part in relinquishing both this fort and that of Niagara, for in earnest these 2 posts are indefensible by reason of the inaccessible cataracts, upon which an ambuscado of 10 Iroquois may repulse 1,000 Frenchmen by the throwing of stones. But after all, I must own that the welfare and preservation of our colonies had an absolute dependence upon these 2 forts, which seemed to ensure the utter destruction of the Iroquois, for they could not stir out of their villages to hunt or to fish without running the risk of having their throats cut by the savages in alliance with us, who being then assured of a safe retreat, would have made continual incursions into the country of those barbarians, and by this means the Iroquois, being unprovided with beaver skins to be given in exchange for guns, powder, ball, and nets, would be starved to death, or at least be obliged to depart their country. In the end of September, Mr. de Bonaventure, captain and owner of a merchant ship, arrived in this port, and brought the news of Mr. de Frontenac's reinstallment in the place of Governor General of Canada, and of the recalling of Mr. de Denonville, whom the Duc de Beauvilliers has recommended to the king for the place of sub-governor to the princes, his grandsons. Some people are uneasy at the recalling of this governor, and 'tis said that the reverend fathers, the Jesuits, fall under the number of the malcontents. For, if we may credit the reports of the country, they contributed in a great measure to the recalling of Mr. de Frontenac 7 or 8 years ago, by acting in concert with the intendant of Chevenot and the Supreme Council, and drawing up accusations against him which had the desired effect, though now the king shows that he is undeceived, by reinstating that gentleman once more in this government. In the meantime, the statesmen of the country that are most guilty know not how to dress this kettle of fish, for they make no question but the new governor will retain a just resentment of what's past. But the gentlemen, merchants, and other inhabitants are making preparations for solemnifying his arrival, which they expect with as much impatience as the Jews do the Messiahs. The very savages that live in the skirts of the colony show an uncommon joy upon the hopes of his return, and indeed we need not think it strange, for that governor drew esteem and veneration not only from the French, but from all the nations of this vast continent, who looked upon him as their guardian angel. Mr. de Denonville begins to pack up his baggage, and that, in effect, is all I can say of him. 'Tis none of my business to meddle with an infinity of affairs that relate to the gentleman's private interest. As to the question whether he has managed well or ill during the course of his government, or whether he was loved or hated, I know nothing of the matter. I am at a loss to know whether he kept a good or a sorry table, for indeed I was never at it. Adieu. I make account to set out for Rochelle, when the vessel that brings our new governor returns for France. I am, Sir, yours, etc. Letter 18, dated at Quebec, November 15, 1689. Giving an account of Mr. de Frontenac's arrival, his reception, his voyage to Montreal, and the repairing of Fort Frontenac. Sir, The intelligence you give me of the adjudging of the lands of La Hontan would have drove me to despair, if you had not assured me at the same time that I might recover it after a century of years, if I had the misfortune to live so long, upon the condition of reimbursing to the possessor the sum that he paid for it, and of proving that I was actually in the king's service in the remote parts of the world when that estate was sold. To speak to the purpose, Mr. de Frontenac has countermanded the leave I had to go for France, and has offered me a free access to his pocket and his table. All the arguments I offered have no influence upon him, and so I am bound to obey. This new governor arrived at Quebec the 15th of October. He came on shore at 8 o'clock at night and was received by the Supreme Council and all the inhabitants in arms, with flambeaux both in the city and upon the harbor, with a triple discharge of the great and small guns, and illuminations in all the windows of the city. That same night he was complimented by all the companies of the town, and above all by the Jesuits, who upon that occasion made a very pathetic speech, though the heart had less hand in it than the mouth. The next day he was visited by all the ladies, whose inward joy appeared in their countenances as much as in their words. Several persons made fireworks, while the governor and his retinue sung Te Deum in the great church. These solemn demonstrations of joy increased from day to day, till the new governor set out for Monreal, and the conduct of the people upon this head afforded signal proofs of the satisfaction they had in his return, and of their resting assured that his wise conduct and noble spirit would preserve the repose and tranquility that he always kept up during his first 10 years' government. All the world adored him and styled him Redemptor Patria, to which title he had a just claim, for all the inhabitants of these colonies agree that when he came first to Canada, he found all things in confusion and distress. At the time, the Iroquois had burned all the plantations and cut the throats of some thousands of the French. The farmer was knocked on the head in his field. The traveler was murdered upon the road, and the merchant ruined for want of commerce. All the planters were pinched with famine. The war rendered the country desolate, and, in a word, New France had infallibly perished, if this governor had not made that peace with the barbarians that I spoke of in my 5th letter. The bringing of that peace to bear was an action of greater importance than you can well imagine, for these barbarians grounded all their wars upon a personal enmity, whereas the European ruptures depend more upon interest than upon pure revenge. Mr. de Saint-Vallier, the Bishop of Quebec, arrived likewise on the 15th at the same port. He had embarked in the preceding spring on board of a bark that he had hired to transport him to Acadia, to Newfoundland, and to the other countries of his diocese. Mr. de Frontenac, our governor, set out for Montreal in a canoe 4 or 5 days after his arrival, and I had the honor to accompany him. All endeavors were used to dissuade him from undertaking that voyage, when the season was so cold and so far advanced. For, as I informed you before, the ice is thicker and stronger here in October than 'tis at Paris in January, which is very strange. Notwithstanding all the remonstrances drawn from the hardships and inconveniencies of the voyage, he slighted the fatigues of the water, and threw himself into a canoe in the 68th year of his age. Nay, he took the abdication of Fort Frontenac so much to heart that he had gone straight thither if the nobility, the priests, and the inhabitants of Montreal had not entreated him with joint supplications not to expose his person to the danger of the falls and cataracts that lie in that passage. In the meantime, some gentlemen of Canada, followed by 100 coureurs de bois, under the command of Mr. Mantet, ventured upon the voyage, with intent to learn the state of the fort. I acquainted you in my last letter that Mr. de Valrennes had blown up the walls of the fort when he made his retreat, but by good luck the damage was not so great as was took to be, for the party commanded by Mr. Mantet have already reared up the ruinous wall to the height of some fathoms, and will continue to work upon the repair of the fort all this winter. This news Mr. de Frontenac received last night, which was the 6th after his return to the city. I had forgot to tell you that he brought with him out of France some of those Iroquois that Mr. de Denonville had sent to the galleys, as I intimated in my 13th letter, the rest having perished in their chains. Of all these unfortunate barbarians that he has brought back, the most considerable is one that goes by the name of Iroqueae. He was not used as a galley slave, in regard that he was the leader of the Governours, and the governor has lodged him in the castle in consideration of the esteem he shows, both for Mr. de Frontenac and for the French nation. Some flatter themselves with the hopes that some accommodation with the 5 Iroquois nation may be effected by his mediation. And for that end, proposals of peace are now in agitation. But I have 3 good reasons for predicting that such a design will prove abortive. I have already laid these reasons before Mr. de Frontenac, who gave me to know that after the departure of the ships he would discourse me upon that head. I shall not offer the particulars of his interview with Monsieur and Madame de Denonville till such time as you and I have an opportunity of talking under the rose. Some officers accompany Mr. Denonville and his lady to France, in hopes of being preferred. In all probability the ships will set sail tomorrow, for we have now a fair and gentle westerly gale. Besides that the season for quitting this post is almost spent. I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 19. Dated at Montreal, October 2, 1690, relating the attempts upon New England and New York, a fatal embassy sent by the French to the Iroquois, and an ill-concerted enterprise of the English and the Iroquois in marching by land to attack the French colony. Sir, about 15 days since, a ship of Rochelle laden with wine and brandy arrived in this harbor, and the captain took care to convey a letter from you to my hands. As to your desire of having a circumstantial account of the trade of Canada, I cannot satisfy it at present, for I am not as yet so thoroughly acquainted with all its branches. But I assure you that some time or other I shall send you such memoirs as will give you satisfaction upon that head. In the meantime, I hope you'll be contented with an account of what passed in the country since the day of my last. As soon as Mr. Denonville set out from Quebec, upon his return to France, Mr. de Frontenac took possession of the fort, which is the common residence of our Governor-General, and ordered one of our best architects to make preparations for rebuilding it as soon as he could. In the beginning of this year, Mr. de Iberville attempted to pillage a small village in New York, called by the Iroquois Corlar, which name they likewise give to all the governors of that English colony. This gentleman, who is a Canadese, was attended by 500 coureurs de bois and the like number of savages, and the whole party made the expedition over snow and ice, notwithstanding that they had 300 leagues to march backward and forward, and that the roads were very rugged and troublesome. Mr. d'Iberville met with wonderful success, for after he had pillaged, burned, and sacked that little village with the adjacent cantons, he fell in with a party of 100 Iroquois and defeated them entirely. Much about the same time, Mr. de Portneuf, another Canada gentleman, marched out at the head of 300 men, one half savages and the other half coureurs de bois, with intent to possess himself of a fort belonging to the English called Kennebec, which stands upon the sea coast of New England, towards the frontiers of Acadia. The garrison of this fort made a brave defense, but there being great quantities of granados and other fireworks thrown in upon them, while the savages, contrary to their custom, scaled the palisadoes on all hands, the governor was obliged to surrender upon discretion. 'Tis said that in this action the coureurs de bois did their duty very bravely, but the enterprise had proved successless without the assistance of the savages. As soon as the rivers were navigable, Mr. de Frontenac offered to send me with proposals of peace to the Iroquois, but I made answer that since his pocket and his table had been free to me during the winter, I could not imagine that he had a mind to be rid of me so soon. Being obliged by this reply to unfold my meaning, I remonstrated to him that, the King of England having lost his crown and war being proclaimed, the governors of New England and New York would infallibly use their utmost efforts to excite these banditos to redouble their incursions. That, for that end, they would furnish them with ammunition gratis, and even join them in order to attack our towns, and above all, that the intrigue of the rat had so provoked them, that in my opinion, 'twas impossible to appease them. Upon these considerations, I humbly beseeched him to have some other person in his view, in case he persisted in his design of making a trial of that nature. The Chevalier Du was singled out for this fatal embassy, being attended by one Cullen, as interpreter of the Iroquois language, and 2 young Canadians. They set out in a canoe, and when they came in sight of the village of the Onontagues, were received with the honorable salvo of several good blows, and conducted with the same ceremony to the village. Such a retinue could not but be disagreeable to the gentlemen that came to make offers of a peace. The ancient men, being quickly assembled, thought it most proper to send them back with a favorable answer, and in the meantime to engage some of the Agnias and Onoyotes to lie in wait for them at the cataracts of the river, and there kill 2, sending the 3rd back to Quebec, and carrying the 4th to their village, where there would be found some English that would shoot them, that is, that would give them the same usage as the rat did to their ambassadors. So true it is that that action sticks in their stomachs. This project had actually been put in execution, if it had not been for some of the planters of New York, who were then among the barbarians, having come thither on purpose to animate them against us. These planters knew so well how to influence the barbarians that were already bent upon revenge, that a company of young barbarians burned them all alive, excepting the Chevalier Du, whom they tied hand and foot and sent him bound to Boston, with a design to pump out of him a view of the conditions of our colonies and forces. This piece of news we received 2 months after, by some slaves that made their escape from the Iroquois, and Mr. de Frontenac, when surprised with such dismal news, declared that out of 20 captains that offered to execute that commission, and would have taken the employment for an honor, I was the only one that had been capable of foreseeing its bad success. June the 24th, I embarked for this place in a sluggish brigantine that the captain of the governor's guard had caused to be built the foregoing winter. This venerable vessel had the honor to lodge the intendant and his lady, and all of us being in no haste, spent 10 or 12 days by the way, and feasted like kings every night. Mr. de Frontenac marked out a fort in his passage to the city of Trois-Rivières, which I spoke of before. 15 days after our arrival in this place, a certain savage whose name was Plague came and gave us notice that he had discovered the body of 1,000 English and 500 Iroquois that marched up to attack us. Upon this intelligence, all our troops crossed over to the meadow of Madeleine opposite to the city, and there encamped in conjunction with 300 or 400 savages that were our allies, in order to give the enemy a warm reception. Our camp was no sooner formed than Mr. Frontenac detached 2 or 3 small parties of the savages to observe the enemy. These parties came soon back, after having surprised some straggling Iroquois at hunting on the confines of Champlain Lake. The prisoners informed us that the English, being unable to encounter the fatigues of the march, and unprovided with a sufficient stock of provisions, Both they and the Iroquois were returned to their own country. This account being confirmed by other savages, our troops decamped and marched back to this place, from whence I was detached some days after to command a party that was to cover the reapers of Fort Roland, which lies in this island. When the harvest was over, I returned to this place, along with the Hurons and the Ottawas, who had come down from their own country in pursuit of their usual trade in skins, an account of which you had in my 8th letter. These traders continued here 15 days, and then marched home. This, sir, is a summary of all our occurrences of moment since the last year. About 15 days hence, I think to set out for Quebec, in Mr. de Frontenac's brigantine. I conclude with my usual compliment. Sir, yours, etc. Letter 20. Dated at Rochelle, January 12, 1691. Being a relation of a second and very important expedition of the English by sea, in which is contained a letter written by the English Admiral to the Count of Frontenac, with this Governours Verbal Answer, as also an account of the author's departure for France. Sir, I am arrived at last at Rochelle, from whence I now transmit you a relation of all that passed in Canada since the date of my last letter. In the space of a few days after that date, Mr. de Frontenac received advice that a strong fleet of English ships amounting to 34 sail was seen near Tadoussac. Immediately he got on board of his brigantine and ordered all the troops to embark in canoes and boats and to row night and day to prevent the enemy, all which was happily put in execution. At the same time, he gave orders to Mr. de Calieres to bring down as many of the inhabitants as possibly he could. We rowed with such expedition and diligence that we arrived the 3rd day at Quebec. As soon as Mr. de Frontenac debarked, he viewed the weakest posts and ordered them to be fortified without loss of time. He raised the batteries in several places, and though in that capital city we had but 12 great guns and but little ammunition, yet he seemed to be resolutely bent upon an obstinate resistance to the efforts of the enemy's fleet, which in the meantime stood catching of flies at the distance of 2 leagues from Quebec. We took the advantage of their slow approaches and worked incessantly to put ourselves in a posture of defense. Our troops, our militia, and our Confederate savages came up to us on all hands. 'Tis certain that if the English Admiral had made his descent before our arrival at Quebec, or even 2 days after, he had carried the place without striking a blow, for at that time there was not 200 French in the city, which lay open and exposed on all hands. But instead of doing that, he cast anchor towards the point of the Island of Orleans, and lost 3 days in consulting the captains of the ships before they came to a resolution. He took the Sieur Joliet with his lady and his mother-in-laws in a bark in the river of St. Lawrence, 3 merchant men from France, and 1 laden with beaver skins from Hudson Bay entered the river of Saguenay by the way of Tadoussac, where they skulked, and after hauling their guns ashore, raised very good batteries. To be short, the officers of the enemy's fleet came to a resolution after the loss of 3 or 4 days in useless consultations, during which time we were joined on all hands by great numbers of inhabitants and soldiers. Pursuant to the resolution of the councils of war, the English Admiral, namely Sir William Phips, sent out his sloop with a French flag upon its prow, which made up to the city with sound of trumpet. Upon this, Mr. de Frontenac sent out another with a French officer to meet it, who found an English major in the sloop, who gave him to understand that he had the charge of a letter from his general to the Governor of Canada, and hoped he might be allowed to deliver it himself. Upon that, the French officer took him into his sloop, and having blindfolded him, conducted him to the governor's chamber, where his face being uncovered, he delivered him a letter, the substance of which was this: I, Sir William Phips, General of the Forces of New England, by sea and land, to Count Frontenac, Governor-General of Quebec, by orders from and in the name of William III and Mary King and Queen of England, I'm come to make myself master of this country, but in regard that I have nothing so much in view as the preventing of effusion of blood, I require you to surrender at discretion your cities, castles, forts, towns, as well as your persons, assuring you at the same time that you shall meet with all manner of good usage, civility, and humanity. If you do not accept of this proposal without any restriction, I will endeavor, by the assistance of heaven, on which I rely, and the force of my arms, to make a conquest of them. I expect a positive answer in writing in the space of an hour, and in the meantime give you notice that after the commencement of hostilities I shall not entertain any thoughts of accommodation. Signed, William Phips. After the interpreter had translated the letter to Mr. de Frontenac, who was then surrounded with officers, he ordered the captain of his guards to make a gibbet before the fort, in order to hang the poor major, who in all appearance understood French, for upon the pronouncing of this fatal sentence he was like to swoon away. And indeed I must say the major had some reason to be affected, for he had certainly been hanged if the bishop and the intendant, who to his good luck were then present, had not interceded on his behalf. Mr. de Frontenac pretended that they were a fleet of pirates, or of persons without commission, for that the King of England was then in France. But at last, the governor, being appeased, ordered the major to repair forthwith on board of his admiral, against whom he could defend himself the better, for not being attacked. At the same time, he declared that he knew no other king of Great Britain than James II, that his rebellious subjects were pirates, and that he dreaded neither their force nor their threats. This said, he threw Admiral Phips' letter in the major's face, and then turned his back upon him. Upon that, the poor ambassador took fresh courage, and looking upon his watch, took the liberty to ask Mr. de Frontenac if he could not have his answer in writing before the hour elapsed. But the governor made answer, with all the haughtiness and disdain imaginable, that his admiral deserved no other answer than what flew from the mouth of cannons and muskets. These words were no sooner pronounced than the major was forced to take his letter again, and being blindfolded, was reconducted to his sloop, in which he rowed towards the fleet with all expedition. The next day, about 2 in the afternoon, 60 sloops were sent ashore with 10 or 1200 men, who stood upon the sand in very good order. After that, the sloops went back to the ships and brought ashore the like complement of men, which was afterward joined by a third complement of the same number. As soon as these troops were landed, they began to march towards the city, with drums beating and colors flying. This descent was made over against the Isle of Orleans, about a league and a half below Quebec, but 'twas not so expeditious, but that our Confederate savages, with 200 coureurs de bois and 50 officers, had time to post themselves in a copse of thick brambles, which lay half a league off the place of landing. It being impossible for so small a party to come to an open battle with a numerous enemy, they were forced to fight after the manner of the savages, that is, to lay ambuscados from place to place in the copse, which was a quarter of a league broad. This way of waging war proved wonderfully successful to us, for our men being posted in the middle of the copse, we suffered the English to enter and then fired upon them, lying flat upon the ground till they fired their pieces, after which we sprung up, and drawing into knots here and there, repeated our fire with such success that the English militia, perceiving our savages, fell into confusion and disorder, and their battalions were broke, insomuch that they betook themselves to flight, crying out, "Indians, Indians!" and gave our savages the opportunity of making a bloody slaughter among them, for we found 300 men left upon the spot, without any other loss on our side than that of 10 coureurs de bois, 4 officers, and 2 savages. The next day, the English landed 4 pieces of brass cannon mounted like field pieces and fought very bravely, though they were very ill-disciplined. 'Tis certain there was no want of courage on their side, and their want of success must be imputed to their unacquaintedness with military discipline, to their being enfeebled by the fatigues of the sea, and to the ill conduct of Sir William Phips, who upon this enterprise could not have done more than he did, if he had been engaged by us to stand still with his hands in his pockets. This day passed over more peaceably than the next, for then the English made a fresh attempt to force their passage through the cups by the help of their artillery, but they lost 300 or 400 more in the attempt, and were forced to retire with all diligence to the landing place. On our side we lost Mr. de Saint Helene, who died of a wound in his leg, and about 40 Frenchmen and savages. This victory animated us so much that we pursued the English to their camp, and lay all night flat upon the ground just by it, with a design to attack it by the break of day. But they saved us the labor, for they embarked about midnight with such confusion that we killed 50 more of them, rather by chance than by dexterity, while they were getting into their boats. When day came, we transported to Quebec their tents and their cannon, which they had left behind them, the savages being in the meantime employed in stripping the dead in the wood. The same day that the descent was made, Sir William Phips weighed and came to an anchor with 4 great ships, at the distance of a musket shot from the lower city, where we had only 1 battery of 6 or 8 pounders. There he cannonadoed for 24 hours so handsomely that the fire of the great guns equaled that of the small arms. The damage they did to the roofs of the houses amounted to 5 or 6 pistols, for as I informed you in my first letter, the walls of the houses are so hard that a ball cannot pierce them. When Sir William Phips had made an end of these glorious exploits, he sent to the man of Mr. de Frontenac some English prisoners, in exchange for the Sieur Joliet, with his wife and his mother and some seamen, which was forthwith put in execution. This done, the fleet weighed anchor and steered homeward. As soon as the 3 merchantmen that lay skulking in the river of Saguenay saw the fleet running below Tadoussac with full sail before a westerly gale, they put their guns aboard, and pursuing their voyage with great satisfaction, arrived at Quebec on the 12th of November. They had scarce put their cargo on shore, when the bitter cold covered the river with ice, which damaged their ship so much that they were forced to run them ashore. This troublesome frost was as uneasy to me as to Mr. de Frontenac, for I then saw that I was obliged to pass another winter in Canada, and Mr. de Frontenac was at a loss to contrive a way of sending the king advice of this enterprise. But by good luck, there came all of a sudden a downfall of rain, which was followed by a thaw, and was equally acceptable to us both. Immediately the governor ordered an unrigged frigate to be rigged and fitted out, which was done accordingly with such dispatch that the ballast sails, ropes, and masts were all in order almost as soon as the orders were given out. When the frigate was ready to sail, the governor told me that the making of France as soon as ever I could would be a piece of important service, and that I ought rather to perish than to suffer myself to be taken by the enemy, or to put in at any port whatsoever by the way. At the same time, he gave me a particular letter to Mr. de Seignelay, the purpose of which was much to my advantage. I put to sea the 20th of November, the like of which was never seen in that place before. At the Isle of Coudres we escaped luckily, for there the northeast wind blew so hard upon us that after we had dropped anchor, we thought to have been split in pieces in the night time. The rest of our passage was good enough, for we encountered but one storm till we arrived at this place. Indeed, we met with contrary winds, about 150 leagues off the coast of France, which obliged us to traverse and lie by for a long time, and 'twas for this reason that our passage was so long. I hear you are now in Provence. and that Mr. de Seignelay is gone upon a voyage to the other world, which is of a quite different nature from that I have just performed. In earnest, sir, his death is a last misfortune to the Navy of France, to the colonies of the two Americas, and to me in particular, since Mr. de Frontenac's recommendatory letter is thereby rendered useless to me. I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 21, dated at Rochelle, July 26, 1691, containing a description of the courts or offices of the ministers of state, and the view of some services that are ill rewarded at court. Sir, the letter you writ to me 2 months ago came to my hands at Paris, but I could not give you an answer there, because I had not then done my business. Now that I am returned to Rochelle, I have leisured time enough to inform you of all that befell me since my return to France. As soon as I arrived at Versailles, I waited upon Mr. de Pontchartrain, who succeeded Mr. de Seignelay. I represented to him that Mr. de Frontenac had given me a letter to his predecessor, in which he took notice of the services I had done. I remonstrated to him that my estate being seized upon and there being several lawsuits to be adjusted where my presence was necessary, I hoped His Majesty would give me leave to quit his service. He made answer that he had been informed of the state of my affairs, and that I was allowed to pursue the management of them till the departure of the last ships that are bound this year for Quebec, to which place he meaned I should return. Having received this answer, I went from Versailles to Paris, where my relations drew me into a consultation of several councillors, who declared that my affairs were so perplexed that in their opinion I could not have them adjusted in so short a time. In the meantime, the crowns I was forced to lug out for this consultation turned my stomach against the going to law with persons that had so much interest in the Parliament of Paris, insomuch that I was almost in the mind of losing my right rather than to enter upon the lawsuit. However, I did not fail to put in for a provision upon my confiscated estate by virtue of my being actually in the service. But the soliciting of that cost me so much trouble and charges that though my powerful adversaries had not been able to prevent the obtaining of my request, yet the sum adjudged thereupon would not be sufficient to answer the charges I was at. Messieurs de Bragalon are very honourable gentlemen, as you know very well. 'Tis true, they love pistols better than their relations, and upon that principle contented themselves in doing me the honour of their good advice, for their generosity does not go much further, and if I had no other refuge than theirs, I should be but in a sorry condition. The Abbot of Écoutets, who is more liberal, though not so rich as they, made me a present of 100 louis d'or, which I applied to the payment of the fees, for being received into the Order of St. Lazarus. The ceremony of that installment was performed in the Monsieur de Louvois' chamber and did not last so long as the telling of the money. I was in hopes that this generous abbot would have bestowed upon me some simple benefice that he might have thrown in my way, without injuring himself. But it seems a scruple of conscience stood my enemy. Upon the whole, sir, I was even forced at last to go to Versailles to solicit for a place, which is the most cutting and vexatious office in the world. But do consider, sir, that in those royal apartments crowns fly, and nobody knows where they go. One must patiently attend 5 or 6 hours a day in Mr. de Pontchartrain's apartments, only to show himself every time that the minister goes out or comes in. He no sooner appears than every one crowds in to present memorials clogged with 50 reasons which commonly fly off as light as the wind. As soon as he receives these petitions, he gives them to some secretary or other that follows him, and this secretary carries them to Messieurs de Latouche, de Begon, and de Salubery, whose footmen receive pistols from most of the officers, who without that expedient would be in danger of catching cold at the door of the office of these deputies. 'Tis from that expedient alone that their good or bad destiny must flow, pray, undeceive yourself as to your notion of the protection of great lords. The time is gone in which the ministers granted whatever they asked for their bastards, their footmen, and their vassals. There is but 2 or 3 princes or dukes who, being great favorites, will meddle in protecting those that have no immediate dependence upon them. And if these do it, 'tis very seldom, for you know that the gentry of France is in no great circumstances. And these great lords have oftentimes poor friends of their own, for whom they are obliged to ask places, in order to their subsistence. As the world goes now, the ministers are upon such a foot that they'll refuse anything to persons the highest dignity above court, by replying, "The king will have it so," or "The king will have it otherwise." And as for the topic of merit, that's such a frightful monster that it can have no reception in the ministers' offices. Nay, most of the ministers are struck with horror when they think of it. 'Tis the ministers, in effect, that dispose of all the places, though it appears as if it were the king. They do what they please, without being accountable to him, for he puts all upon the affection and zeal they ought to have for his service. They carry extracts to him, in which the merit of the officers they mean to prefer is either supposed or extolled, but the memorials of those they do not like are far from appearing. I'm sorry I should be obliged to lay this truth before you. However, I mention no particular minister, for they are not all of that kidney. I know some of them that would scorn to do the least injustice to any man whatsoever, and would not suffer their Suisses or their lackeys, or even their deputies or clerks, to intrigue for the preferment of such and such persons by the means of pistols. These dexterous intriguers do by indirect means make more officers than you have hairs on your head, and 'tis for that reason they are saluted a league off, and dignified as seriously with the title of Monsieur as their masters are with that of Monseigneur or Grandeur. These last titles have been acquired by our ministers and secretaries of state with as much glory as by our bishops. We must not think it strange, therefore, that even our general officers have the words Monseigneur and Grandeur so frequently in their mouths, provided it be accompanied with that of Your Excellency. I swear, sir, I could find matter for a book of 300 pages in folio, if I had a mind to be particular upon the intrigues of the officers and ministers of state, upon the means by which the solicitors compass their ends, the notorious knavery of a certain sort of people, and the patience with which the officers must be fortified, upon the contempt that those meet with, who have no other recommendation than merit, and in a word, upon all the instances of injustice that are practiced without the king's knowledge. Let it be as it will, I must acquaint you that after a fruitless solicitation for what I thought I had some title to, in consideration of my services, I received this answer, that the king would order Mr. de Frontenac to provide me as handsomely as he could when an occasion offered, so that I was forced to rest satisfied with my answer, and resolved to continue a captain forever, for I know very well that the Governor of Canada cannot prefer me to a higher post. Having left Versailles, I came hither with all expedition, and then went to receive the commands of the Intendant of Roquefort. He acquainted me that the ship called Honoré was fitting up, and that I might sail as soon as 'twas ready. He recommended to me the Chevalier de Maupeou, Madame Pontchartrain's nephew, who is to go along with me. This gentleman, having the curiosity to see Canada, is come hither from Paris, with a handsome retinue. 'Tis in vain to set forth to him the tediousness of the passage, the inconveniencies of the sea, and the disagreeableness of the country, for all these arguments serve only to inflame his curiosity. The Count d'Aunay is to convoy us to the latitude of Cape Finisterre, at which place he is to take leave of us and return to Roquefort. We only stay for a fair wind to put to sea. I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 22. Dated at Quebec, November 10, 1691. which contains an account of the author's departure from Rochelle to Quebec, of his voyage to the mouth of the river St. Lawrence, of a rencounter he had with an English ship which he fought, of the stranding of his ship, of his sailing through the river St. Lawrence, of the news he received that a party of the English and Iroquois had defeated a body of the French troops. Sir, 2 days after I wrote to you, we set sail from the harbor of Rochelle upon our great voyage to Canada. On the 5th of August, we perceived a great ship, which the Count of Onay gave chase to, who having a better sailor, came up with her in 3 hours' time, whereupon she, on a sudden, put on Genoese colors. Some guns were fired upon the prow, to oblige her to strike, but the captain was so obstinate that Mr. de Onay was forced to give her a broadside, which killed 4 or 5 of the seamen, whereupon the rest were obliged to put out their longboat and carry to his ship their passports and bills of lading. On the 10th, after they had taken the latitude, the pilots thinking that they were even with Cape Finisterre, Mr. de Onay sent out his longboat to acquaint me that he was then upon his return home, upon which I wrote him a letter of thanks. Father Bechefer, a Jesuit, who had been many years superior of the College of Quebec, whither he was now going in the same capacity, was forced to throw himself into this longboat in order to his return into France, having found himself continually indisposed from the first day we put to sea. On the 23rd of August, we had a great storm of wind from the northwest, which lasted about 24 hours, being then 100 leagues off the bank of Newfoundland. This bank takes its name from the island of Newfoundland, a map of which is here annexed. When the storm was over, there succeeded a wind from the northeast, which drove us in 10 or 12 hours to the mouth of the river of St. Lawrence. On the 6th of September, we discovered the ship sailing from the coast of Gaspé, which bore down upon us with a full sail. We thought at first that they were French coming from Quebec, but their way of working the ship discovered to us within an hour after that they were enemies. After we knew them, we prepared to fight them, and they being about a league to the windward of us, came quickly down upon us with full sail, within musket shot. Presently they put up English colors, and gave us a broadside, and we put up our own colors, and paid them home in their own coin. The fight lasted 2 hours, and both sides fired continually one upon another, but the sea being tempestuous, we were obliged to sheer off as night came on, without suffering any other loss than the wounding of 2 seamen, and the receiving of 28 or 30 shot in our masts, sails, and rigging. 2 days after, we met Mr. Duta, captain of the Hazardous, who was homeward bound for France, being a convoy to 10 or 12 merchant ships. He gave me some refreshments and told me some news of Canada, which were very acceptable. We pursued our course in spite of the southeast wind, which obliged us to tack about several ways, till we came to Portneuf, near to Tadoussac. In this place we were stranded by the fault of the coasting pilot, who being obstinate for casting anchor near the land, was like to have been the cause of a shipwreck. At midnight, the ship was so dashed against the sand that I thought she was split in pieces, but the tide ebbing by degrees, she was left lying upon the coast without any apparent damage. I presently caused a kedger to be dropped in the deep water, belagged with several ropes called grillins epices, and the next morning the tide returning set the ship afloat, and then we hauled it in with the capstan. On the 13th, we cast anchor near the Red Island. On the next day, being the 14th, we passed that channel without danger, by the favor of a fresh gale from the northeast. On the 15th, we cast anchor at the Isle of Hares. On the 16th, we passed the Isle of Coudray. On the 17th, we weathered the Cape of Tourmente, and the next day we anchored in this port. From the mouth of the river to this place, we had the finest sunshine days that ever were seen, during which time I had both leisure and opportunity to view the coast on the right hand and the left, while we tacked about and about as the wind served. When I saw a great many rivers on the south side, I asked the pilots why the ship used to steer their course on the north side, where there is no anchorage to be found, but at Papinache, the Seven Isles, and Port Neuf. They answered me that the ordinary breezes of the rough northwest wind, which blows upon this river for 3/4 of a year, were the true cause why they durst not go far from the north side, and that nobody could insure a ship that should steer on the south side, except it were in the months of June, July, and August. If it were not for that, I believe it would be more pleasant, more easy, and less dangerous to sail on the south than on the north side, because one might cast anchor every night at the entrance of those rivers which discharge themselves all along that coast, and would not be obliged to be veering about continually day and night, as he is forced to do when he steers his course on the north side. This, sir, is all I had to say at present about our sailing in this river, which I shall have occasion to mention to you again. After our ship cast anchor before Quebec, I landed with the Chevalier Maupeou, whom I conducted to the house of Mr. Frontenac, whom offered to him as well as to me the use of his table and house. I am informed that 300 English and 200 Iroquois approached about 2 months ago to the Isle of Monreal, that the governor of that isle transported 15 companies from the other side of the river to watch their motions, that a detachment of the enemy, having surprised our outguards, attacked the whole body of them, and our camp at the same time with so much vigor and courage that they killed upon the spot more than 300 soldiers, besides 2 captains, 6 lieutenants, and 5 ensigns, and that after this fatal expedition, Mr. Valren, a captain of the Marines, set out from Montreal with a detachment of French and savages to go to Fort Chambly, for fear the Iroquois should attack that post, who, having met in their passage a party of English and Iroquois, attacked them vigorously and defeated them. All these different adventures give me ground to conjecture that it will be much more difficult than 'tis imagined to make a good peace with the 5 nations of the Iroquois. Mr. Frontenac has given the necessary orders to all the neighboring habitations that they should transport a great quantity of stakes and lime in the winter time to the neighborhood of this city. Farewell, sir. The last ships which are to depart hence for France will sail in 3 or 4 days. I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 23. Dated at Nantes, October 25, 1692, containing an account of the taking of some English vessels, of defeating a party of the Iroquois, of an Iroquois burnt alive at Quebec, of another party of these barbarians who, having surprised some coureurs de bois, were afterwards surprised themselves, of the project of an enterprise proposed by Mr. Frontenac to the author, of the author's departure in a frigate for France, and his stopping at Placentia, which was attacked by an English fleet that came to take that post from us, how the English failed in their design, and the author pursued his voyage. Sir, this letter comes from Brittany, and not from Canada, from whence I parted suddenly to return into France about 2 months after I received your letter, which I could not then answer for want of an opportunity. You tell me that you are satisfied with the description I have sent you of the River St. Lawrence, and that you would be very glad to have as exact an account of the whole country of Canada. I can scarce satisfy your desire at present, because I have not yet had time to sort all my memoirs, and therefore you must not take it amiss that I pray you to suspend your curiosity for some time. In the meantime, here follows the relation of some things that happened in Canada, which may be acceptable to you. Immediately after the ships parted from Quebec the last year, Mr. Frontenac ordered a plan to be drawn of a wall to encompass the city, and having transported thither all the materials necessary for building some redoubts of stone, he took care to fortify it during the summer. Some days ago, a gentleman of New England called Nelson was brought prisoner to Quebec, who was taken in the river of Kennebec upon the coast of Acadia, together with 3 ships belonging to him, and because he was a very gallant man, Mr. Frontenac gave him a lodging at his own house and treated him with all manner of civility. About the beginning of this year, this governor gave the command of a party consisting of 150 soldiers to Chevalier Beaucourt, with whom 50 of the savages that were our friends were joined, in order to march on the ice towards Fort Frontenac. About 30 or 40 leagues from Monreal, they met a company of 60 Iroquois, who were discovered by the footsteps of some of their hunters that had straggled out of their cottages. And the next day they were all surprised, and either had their throats cut or were made prisoners. The Sieur de la Plante, who lived in slavery with these wretches, had the good fortune to be present in their company when they were defeated, and he had certainly been killed with his masters if he had not cried out with all of his might, "Spare me, I am a Frenchman." He was one of the 4 officers who had the misfortune to be taken in that fatal incursion which these tigers made into Montreal, as I told you in my 17th letter. The Chevalier Beaucourt returned again to the colony with his party and brought along with him 12 prisoners of the Iroquois, who were immediately conducted to Quebec. After they arrived, Mr. Frontenac did very judiciously condemn 2 of the wickedest of the company to be burned alive with a slow fire. This sentence extremely terrified the governor's lady and the Jesuits. The lady used all manner of supplication to procure a moderation of the terrible sentence, but the judge was inexorable, and the Jesuits employed all their eloquence in vain upon this occasion. The governor answered them that it was absolutely necessary to make some terrible examples of severity to frighten the Iroquois, that since these barbarians burnt almost all the French who had the misfortune to fall into their hands, they must be treated after the same manner, because the indulgence which had hitherto been shown them seemed to authorize them to invade our plantations, and so much the rather to do it, because they run no other hazard than that of being taken and well kept at their masters' houses. But when they should understand that the French caused them to be burnt, they would have a care for the future, how they advanced with so much boldness to the very gates of our cities, and in fine, that the sentence of death being passed, these 2 wretches must prepare to take a journey into the other world. This obstinacy appeared surprising in Mr. Frontenac, who but a little before had favored the escape of 3 or 4 persons liable to the sentence of death, upon the importunate prayer of Madame the Governess. But though she redoubled her earnest supplications, she could not alter his firm resolution as to these 2 wretches. The Jesuits were thereupon sent to baptize them, and oblige them to acknowledge the Trinity and the Incarnation, and to represent to them the joys of paradise and the torments of hell within the space of 8 or 10 hours. You will readily confess, sir, that this was a very bold way of treating these great mysteries, and that to endeavor to make the Iroquois understand them so quickly was to expose them to their laughter. Whether they took these truths for songs, I do not know, but this I can assure you, that from the minute they were acquainted with this fatal news, they sent back these good fathers without ever hearing them, and then they began to sing the song of death according to the custom of the savages. Some charitable person having thrown a knife to them in prison, he who had the least courage of the 2 thrust it into his breast and died of the wound immediately. Some young Hurons of Lorette, aged between 14 and 15 years, came to seize the other and carry him away to the Diamond Cape, where notice was given to prepare a great pile of wood. He ran to death with a great unconcernedness than Socrates would have done if he had been in his case. During the time of execution, he sung continually that he was a warrior, brave and undaunted, that the most cruel kind of death could not shock his courage, that no torments could extort from him any cries, that his companion was a coward for having killed himself through the fear of torment, and lastly, that if he was burnt, he had this comfort, that he had treated many French and Hurons after the same manner. All that he said was very true, and chiefly as to his own courage and firmness of soul, for I can truly swear to you that he neither shed tears, nor was he ever perceived to sigh, but on the contrary, during all the time that he suffered the most horrible torments that could be invented, and which lasted about the space of 3 hours, he never ceased 1 minute from singing. The soles of his feet were roasted before 2 great stones red hot, for more than a quarter of an hour. The tops of his fingers were scorched in a stove of lighted pipes, during which torture he did not draw back his hand. After this, the several joints of his body were cut off, one after another. The nerves of his limbs and arms were distorted with a little iron wand, after such a manner as cannot possibly be expressed. In fine, after many other tortures, the hair of his head was taken off after such a manner that there remained nothing but the skull, upon which these young executioners were going to throw some burning sand, when a certain slave of the Hurons of Lorette, by the order of Madame the Governess, knocked him on the head with a club, which put an end to his martyrdom. As to myself, I vow and swear that the prologue of this tragedy created in me so great a horror that I had not the curiosity to see the end of it, nor to hear this poor wretch sing to the last moments of his life. I have seen so many burnt against my will, amongst those people where I sojourned during the course of my voyages, that I cannot think of it without trouble. 'Tis a sad spectacle, at which everyone is obliged to be present, when he happens to sojourn amongst these savage nations, who inflict this cruel kind of death upon their prisoners of war. For as I have told you in one of my letters, all the savages practice this barbarous cruelty. Nothing is more grating to a civil man than that he is obliged to be a witness of the torments which this kind of martyrs suffer. For if anyone should pretend to shun this sight, or express any compassion for them, he would be esteemed by them a man of no courage. After the navigation was open and free, the Sieur Saint-Michel, a Canadan, set out from Montreal for the Beaver Lakes, at the head of a party of the Coureurs de Bois, with several canoes laden with such goods as are proper for the savages. In their passage from Long Sault to the river of the Ottawas, they met 60 Iroquois who surprised them and cut all their throats except 4 that had the good fortune to escape and carry the news to Montreal. As soon as this fatal accident was known, the Chevalier Vaudreuil put himself in a canoe with a detachment and pursued this party of Iroquois, being followed by 100 Canadians and some Confederate savages. I know not by what chance he had the good fortune to overtake them, but so it was he surprised them and attacked them with vigor, upon which they fought desperately, but at last they were defeated. This victory cost us the lives of many of our savages, and of 3 or 4 of our officers. The Iroquois that were taken were carried to the city of Montreal, near which place they were regaled with a salvo of bastinadoes. About the beginning of the month of July, Mr. Frontenac, having received some news from the commander of the lakes, spoke to me of a certain project which I had formerly shown him to be of great importance, but because he did not sufficiently consider all the advantages that might be reaped from it, and on the contrary apprehended a great many difficulties would attend the putting it in execution, he had altogether neglected this affair, of which I shall give you the following account. I observed to you in my 17th letter the great importance and advantage of the forts of Frontenac and Niagara, and that in the conjuncture of circumstances wherein Mr. Denonville then found them, it was impossible to preserve them. You have also remarked the advantages which the savages have over the Europeans by their way of fighting in the forests of this vast continent, Since we cannot destroy the Iroquois with our own single forces, we are necessarily obliged to have recourse to the savages that are our allies. And 'tis certain, as they themselves foresee, that if these barbarians could compass the destruction of our colonies, they would be subdued by them sooner or later, as it has happened to many other nations. So they know it to be their interest to join with us to destroy these banditis. Now, since they are well affected to this design, we must endeavor to facilitate to them the means of putting it in execution. For you may easily believe that these people, as savage as they are not so void of sense as to travel 200 or 300 leagues from their own country to fight against their enemies without being sure of a place of retreat where they may repose themselves and find provisions. There is no question, therefore, but we should build forts upon the lands of the Iroquois and maintain them in spite of their teeth. This, sir, is what I proposed above a year ago to Mr. Frontenac, and it is what he would have me still to undertake. I project, therefore, to build and maintain 3 forts upon the course of the lakes, with some vessels that shall go with oars, which I will build according to my fancy. But they, being light and of great carriage, may be managed either with oars or a sail, and will also be able to bear the shocks of the waves. I demand 50 seamen of the French Biscay, for they are known to be the most dexterous and able mariners that are in the world. I must also have 200 soldiers, chosen out of the troops of Canada. I will build 3 little castles in several places, one at the mouth of the Lake Erie, which you see in my map of Canada, under the name of Fort Suppose, besides 2 others. The second I will build in the same place where it was when I maintained it in the years 1687 and 1688, whereof I have wrote to you in my 14th and 15th letter, and the third at the mouth of the Bay of Toronto, upon the same lake. 90 men will be sufficient to garrison these 3 redoubts, and perhaps a smaller number, for the Iroquois who never saw a cannon but in a picture, and to whom an ounce of powder is more precious than a louis d'or, can never be persuaded to attack any kind of fortification. I desire of the king, for putting this project in execution, 15,000 crowns a year, for the maintenance, entertainment, subsistence, and pay of these 250 men. It will be very easy for me to transport with the above-mentioned vessels 400 savages into the country of the Iroquois, whenever I have a mind. I can carry provisions for 2,000, and transport as many sacks of Indian corn as are necessary for maintaining these forts both in winter and summer. 'Tis easy to have plenty of hunting and shooting in all the isles, and to contrive ways for crossing the lakes, and it will be so much the more easy to pursue the Iroquois in their canoes and sink them, that my vessels are light and my men fight under a cover. In fine, if you saw the memorial which I am to present to Mr. Pontchartrain, you would find that this enterprise is the finest and most useful that can be invented, to distress the Iroquois in time of war, and confine them within bounds in time of peace. Mr. Frontenac has joined to it a private letter to Mr. Pontchartrain, wherein he observes to him that if this project were well put in execution, these terrible enemies would be obliged in 2 years' time to abandon their country. After this, he adds that he judges me sufficiently qualified to go upon such an enterprise, and believes I will make my point good. Perhaps he might have light on others that know the country and customs of the savages better than I do, but by an accident which does not tend much to my advantage, I have purchased the esteem and friendship of these savages, which in my opinion was the only reason that moved Mr. de Frontenac to single out me for this service. July the 27th, the governor having given me his packet for the court, and the St. Anne frigate being rigged and fitted out according to his orders, I embarked in the port of Quebec, and after 5 days' sailing, we met in the river of St. Lawrence, over against Mont Notre Dame, 12 merchantmen bound from France for Quebec, under the convoy of Mr. de Iberville, captain of the Polly. August the 8th, we got clear of the Bay of St. Lawrence by the help of a westerly gale, and that in such fair and clear weather that we descried the islands of Cape Breton and Newfoundland as distinctly as if we had been within a musket shot of them. The 9 or 10 following days were so far of a different stamp that we could scarce see from prow to the poop of the ship, for all of a sudden there fell the thickest and darkest fog that I ever saw. At the end of these days, the horizon clearing up, we stood in for Newfoundland, descrying Cape St. Mary, and by making all the sail we could, arrived that very day in the port of Placentia. In that port I found 50 fishermen, most of which were of French Biscay, and thought to have set out for France along with them in a few days. But they were longer in getting ready than I thought for, and when we were just ready to break ground, we were informed by some fishermen that 5 large English ships were come to an anchor near Cape St. Mary. This intelligence proved very true, for on the 15th of September they cast anchor in sight of Placentia. The 16th they weighed, and came to an anchor in the road, out of the reach of our guns. Upon this the governor was not a little perplexed, for he had but 50 soldiers in his fort, and a very small moiety of ammunition. Besides, the fort was commanded by a mountain, from whence he might be galled with stones flung out of slings, and 'twas to be feared the English would possess themselves of that high ground. I marched with 60 of the seamen belonging to the fishermen, to prevent their landing, in case they attempted to make a descent at a certain place called La Fontaine, and I compassed my end without firing a gun. In effect, 600 or 700 English put in to the land in 20 sloops, with a design to have landed at that place, upon which my vigorous Cantabrians, being full of fire and forwardness, appeared too soon upon the shore, in spite of my teeth, and by that means obliged the English to take another course, and row with all their might to the back of a little cape, where they threw in a barrel of pitch and tar that burnt 2 arpents of thickers. The 18th, about noon, perceiving that a little sloop put off from the Admiral with a white flag on its prow, and made towards the fort, I run in thither immediately. The governor had took care to send out one of his own sloops with the same flag to meet the other, and was surprised when she returned with 2 English officers on board. These officers gave the governor to understand that the admiral desired he would send an officer on board of him, which was done accordingly, for Mr. de Costebelle and I went on board of the admiral, who received us with all respect and civility, and regaled us with sweetmeats and several sorts of wines, with which we drank the healths of the admirals of France and England. He showed us his whole ship, to the very carriages of the guns, and then gave the Sieur de Costebelle to know that 'twould be a great trouble to him to be obliged to take Placentia by the force of arms, in regard that he foresaw such an enterprise would prove fatal to the governor, to the garrison, and all the inhabitants, upon the account that he would find a great deal of difficulty in preventing the pillaging and other disorders, that in order to avoid this misfortune 'twould be a prudential part in the governor to come to a composition. Our officer, being fully acquainted with the governor's mind, made answer in his name that he was resolved upon a vigorous defense, and would rather spring the place in the air than surrender it to the enemies of the king his master. After a mutual exchange of compliments, we took leave of him, and being ready to get into our sloop, he told us with embraces that he was infinitely sorry he could not salute us with his guns, in the room of which he ordered 5 or 6 huzzas, with a "Long live the King." When we went into the boat, we returned him the same number of shouts, to which he returned a 7th that finished the ceremony. Upon our return to the fort, Mr. de Costebelle gave the governor an account of the force of the admiral's ship. They sent Albans, so the ship was called, carried 66 guns mounted, and 600 men complement, but the other ships appeared to be of less force. The next day, which was the 19th, they advanced within cannon shot of the fort, where they lay by while a sloop rowed up to the batteries. The governor sent out another sloop to know what the matter was, and was answered that if he had a mind for a parley in the time of the engagement, he should put up a red flag for a signal. I was then posted at La Fontaine to oppose a descent, for that was the only place that could be serviceable to the English in order to master Placentia. The English ought to have considered that their cannon would do no service against an impenetrable rampart, and that they would lose their labor in shooting against flints and earth. But it seems they were obliged by express orders from the Prince of Orange to do it, and at the same time to expose themselves to the danger of being sunk, which had certainly been effected, if we had had powder and ball enough, for the cannonading lasted almost 5 hours. The 20th, a French pilot who was prisoner on board of the Admiral made his escape by throwing himself into the sea in the night time. He landed at the place where I lay in ambuscade, and after he had given me an account of what passed in the fleet, I sent him to the governor's house. He informed me that they had designed a descent with 700 or 800 men, but altered their resolution upon the apprehension that there were 14 or 1500 seamen ready to oppose them. That they were of the opinion that my 60 Biscayans, who discovered themselves upon the shore at La Fontaine, in spite of all I could do, had no other view but to draw him into an ambuscade, by tempting him to come up. The 21st, they set sail with a northeast gale after having burnt all the houses at Point Verte, where the governor had sent a detachment by way of precaution that same very day. But the ways were so impracticable that the detachment could not get there in time to oppose the enemy. This one may justly say that if it had not been for the captains of the Biscay ships that were then at Placentia, that place had undoubtedly fallen into the hands of the English, and this I can convince you of when you and I meet. In this bloody expedition, the English lost 6 men, and on the side of Sir Boat, lieutenant of a Nantes vessel, hath his arm shot off. In fine, the English did all that men could do, so that nothing can be said against their conduct. October the 6th. I took shipping in pursuit of my voyage to France, being accompanied with several other vessels. The westerly winds were so favorable to us in our passage that we came to an anchor on the 23rd at Saint Nazarin, which lies but 8 or 9 leagues for this place. I am to set out immediately for Versailles. In the meantime, I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 24, dated at Nantes, May 10, 1693, containing an account of Mr. Frontenac's project, which was rejected at court, and the reason why it was rejected. The king gives the author the lieutenancy of the Isle of Newfoundland, and together with a free independent company. Sir, I am now once more at Nantes, from whence I wrote to you in October last. I am now returned from court, where I presented to Mr. Pontchartrain Mr. Frontenac's letters and the memorial I mentioned in my last. I was answered that it would not be proper to execute the project I proposed, because the 40 seamen which were necessary for my purpose could not now be allowed me, and besides the king had given orders to Mr. Frontenac to make peace with the Iroqueae upon any terms whatsoever. This inconveniency also was found to attend the project, that after the forts which I intended to build upon the lakes were entirely finished, the savages that are our friends and confederates would rather seek after glory by making war upon the Iroquois than take pleasure in hunting the beavers, which would be a considerable damage to the colonies of Canada, that subsist only, as one may say, by the trade of skins, as I shall show you more particularly in a proper place. The English will by no means take it ill that we do not build these forts, for besides that, they are too much concerned for the preservation of the Iroquois. They will always be ready to furnish with merchandise the savage nations that are our allies, as they have done hitherto. I must own myself mightily obliged to the English, who attacked us at Placentia the last year. They declared publicly, though without any just ground, after they arrived in England, that they would infallibly have taken that place if I had not opposed their descent. I have already informed you that I did not at all hinder them from landing at the place where I was posted with 60 Biscayan seamen, so that they attribute to me a glorious action in which I had no share, and by that means have done me so much honour, that His Majesty hath bestowed upon me the lieutenancy of the Isle of Newfoundland and Acadia, which I never deserved upon that score. Thus you see, sir, that many times such persons are preferred who have no other patrons in the world but pure chance. However, I should have been better pleased if I could have put the above-mentioned project in execution, for a solitary life is most grateful to me, and the manners of the savages are perfectly agreeable to my palate. The corruption of our age is so great that it seems the Europeans have made a law to tear one another in pieces by cruel usage and reproaches, and therefore you must not think it strange if I have a kindness for the poor Americans who have done me so many favors. I am to set out the next day after tomorrow from this place in order to embark at Saint Nazaire. The Messieurs d'Anguy, 2 Nantes merchants, have taken upon them to maintain the garrison of Placentia, upon condition of certain grants made by the court, who furnishes them with a ship, wherein I am to have my passage. Pray send me your news by some ships of St. John de Luz, which are to sail from this place within 2 months, in order to truck with the inhabitants of Placentia. I cannot conclude this letter without giving you some account of a dispute I had very lately at my inn, with a Portuguese physician, who had made many voyages to Angola, Brazil, and Goa. He maintained that the people of the continent of America, Asia, and Africa were descended from 3 different fathers, which he thus attempted to prove. The Americans differ from the Asiatics, for they have neither hair nor beard. The features of their face, their color, and their customs are different. Besides that, they know neither meum nor tuum, but have all things in common, without making any property of goods, which is quite contrary to the Asiatic way of living. He added that America was so far distant from the other parts of the world that nobody can imagine how a voyage should be made into this new continent before the use of the compass was found out. That the Africans, being black and flat-nosed, had such monstrous thick lips, such a flat face, such soft woolly hair on their heads, and were in their constitution, manners, and temper so different from the Americans, that he thought it impossible that these 2 sorts of people should derive their original from Adam, whom this physician would have to resemble a Turk or a Persian in his air and figure. I answered him presently that supposing the scripture did not give convincing evidence that all men in general are descended from one first father, yet his reasoning would not be sufficient to prove the contrary, since the difference that is found between the people of America and Africa proceeds from no other cause but the different qualities of the air and climate in these 2 continents. That this appears plainly to be true, because a Negro man and woman, or a savage man and woman, being transplanted into Europe, will produce such children there, who in 4 or 5 generations will infallibly be as white as the most ancient Europeans. The physician denied this matter of fact, and maintained that the children descended from this Negro man or woman would be born there as black as they are in Guinea, but that afterwards the rays of the sun being more oblique and less scorching than in Africa, these infants would not have that black shining luster which is so easily distinguished upon the skin of such Negroes as are brought up in their own country. To confirm his hypothesis, he assured me that he had seen many Negroes at Lisbon as black as in Africa, though their great-grandfather's grandfather had been transplanted into Portugal many years ago. He added also that those who were descended from the Portuguese that dwelt at Angola, Cape Verde, and about 100 years ago, are so little toned that 'tis impossible to distinguish them from the natives of Portugal. He further confirmed his way of reasoning from an uncontestable matter of fact, for, says he, if the rays of the sun were the cause of the blackness of the Negroes, from hence it would follow that the Brazilians, being situate in the same degree from the equator with the Africans, should be as black as they are. But so they are not, for 'tis certain their skin appears to be as clear as that of the Portuguese. But this was not all. He maintained farther that these who are descended from the first savages of Brazil that were transported into Portugal above an age ago have as little hair and beard as their ancestors, and on the contrary, those who are descended from the first Portuguese who peopled the colonies of Brazil are as hairy and have as great beards as if they had been born in Portugal. But, after all, continued he, that all I have said is absolutely true, yet there are some people who rashly maintain that the children of the Africans and Americans will by degrees degenerate in Europe. This may happen to those whose mothers receive the embraces of Europeans, which is the reason why we see so many mulattoes in the Isles of America, in Spain, and in Portugal. Whereas if these women had been so closely kept up in Europe, as the Portuguese women are in Africa and America, the children of the Brazilians would no more degenerate than those of the Portuguese. Such, sir, was the reasoning of this doctor, who hits the matter pretty justly forward the end of his discourse, but his principle is most false and most absurd, for no man can doubt, unless he be void of faith, good sense, and judgment, but that Adam was the only father of all mankind. 'Tis certain that the savages of Canada and all the other people of America have not naturally either hair or beard, that the features of their face and their color approaching to an olive show a vast difference between them and the Europeans. What is the cause of these things I know not, and yet I cannot believe them to be the effect of their air and food. For at that rate, those who are descended from the French that first settled in Canada near 100 years ago, and for the most part run up and down in the woods and live like savages, should have neither beard nor hair, but degenerate also by degrees into savages, which yet never happens. After this physician had alleged all these reasons, he digressed from this subject, and having a mind to discover his extravagant opinions, asked me what I thought of the salvation of so many Americans, to whom in all probability the gospel was never preached. You may very well believe that I made no scruple to condemn them by wholesale to eternal fire, which he took very ill. How can you, said he, condemn these poor people with so much assurance? 'Tis probable that their first father, having never sinned as our Adam did, had a good soul and an upright heart, since his posterity do exactly observe the law of natural equity, which is expressed in Latin in these well-known words: alteri ne feceris quod tibi fieri non vis, and allow no property of goods, nor any distinction or subordination among them, but live as brethren, without disputes, without suits, without laws, and without malice. But supposing, added he, that they were originally descended from Adam, we ought not to believe that they are damned for their ignorance of the Christian doctrine. For who can tell but God may impute to them the merits of Christ's blood, by ways secret and incomprehensible to us? And besides, supposing that man has a free will, His Divine Majesty, without doubt, will have a greater regard to his moral actions than to his worship and belief. The want of knowledge, continued he, is an unhappiness, but not a crime, and who can tell but God has a mind to be honored by infinite ways of paying him homage and respect, as by sacrifices, dances, songs, and the other ceremonies of the Americans. He had scarce made an end of his discourse when I fell foul upon him with all my might as to the preceding points, but after I had given him to understand that if among the multivocati, i.e., those who profess the true religion, who are but a handful of men, there are found but pauci electi. All the Americans must be in a very deplorable condition. He answered me imprudently that I was very rash to determine who should be in the number of the reprobate at the last judgment, and to condemn them without giving any quarter. For, says he, this is to insult the wisdom of God, and to make him deal as capriciously by his creatures, as St. Paul's potter did by his two vessels. Nevertheless, when he saw that I treated him like an impious, unbelieving wretch, he, to be even with me, replied in these foolish words: Fidem ego hic quea dibetur, mysteri sacri interpello, sed fidem illam que bona mentis soror est queog rectam rationem amat. From hence you may judge, sir, whether this fine physician was able to remove mountains. I am, sir, yours, etc. Letter 25. Dated at Viana, in Portugal, January 31st, 1694. The authors departed from France for Placentia. A fleet of 30 English ships came to seize upon that place, but is disappointed and sheers off. The reasons why the English have bad success in all their enterprises beyond sea, the author's adventure with the governor of Placentia, his departure for Portugal, an engagement with a Flushing privateer. Sir, I do not at all doubt but you will be sensibly affected with my sad and fatal misadventure, which I am now to give you an account of. And first you must know that after we had waited for a fair wind 15 or 20 days at Saint Nazaire, we set sail on the 12th of May last. Our passage was neither long nor short, for we arrived at the harbor of Placentia the 20th of June, having taken an English ship laden with tobacco on the edges of the bank of Newfoundland. After I landed, I went to salute Mr. Broilon, governor of Placentia, and declared to him how glad I was to obey the orders of so wise a commander. He answered that he was much surprised to find that I had solicited to be employed there, without acquainting him with it the preceding year, and that he now plainly perceived that the project about the lakes of Canada, which I had mentioned to him, was a mere sham pretense. I endeavored in vain to persuade him to the contrary, for it was not possible for me to undeceive him. Nevertheless, I landed my goods and hired a private house, till such time as I could build one for myself, which I carried on with so much diligence that it was finished in September, by the assistance of the ship carpenters, who were lent me gratis by all the Biscay captains. The Sieur Beret of St. John de Luz arrived at Placentia on the 18th of July with one of his ships, and brought me a letter, wherein you acquaint me that in regard your nephew desires to visit Canada the next year, you would be very glad to have a dictionary of the language of the savages, together with the memoirs which I promised you. On the 16th of September, we perceived an English fleet of 24 sail, which cast anchor in the road much about the time that it was discovered. It was commanded by Sir Francis Wheeler, who had gone to Martinico with the design to seize that isle, and in his return from thence had sailed to New England, to take in some forces and ammunition there, in order to make himself master of Placentia. But when he discovered a redoubt of stone lately built upon the top of the mountain, which I mentioned to you in my last letter but one, he thought it more advisable to return quietly into Europe than to make a fruitless attempt. We had planted 4 cannon upon this high redoubt, which so galled the ships of his fleet that they were forced to weigh anchor and hoist sail sooner than they intended. The fault of the English upon this occasion was that they did not enter the harbor the same day that they appeared before the place. I have observed it many times that attempts do commonly miscarry by delaying them for a little while, and of this I could give you at least 15 or 16 instances within the compass of my own knowledge. But now I return to the quarrel the governor had with me. Fancying that I had solicited my employments without taking notice of him, he treated me with all manner of reproaches and outrages, from the time of my landing to that of my departure, and was not satisfied with appropriating to himself the profits and advantages of the free company that was given me, but likewise stopped without any scruple the pay of the soldiers that were employed in the cod fishing by the inhabitants, and made the rest work without wages. I shall take no notice of his public extortion, for though he has formally counteracted the 10 articles contained in the orders of Louis X, yet he hath so many friends in all these courts that he could not be found guilty. There is some pleasure in making presents in his way, for by them he has made 50,000 crowns per fas and nefas, in the space of 3 or 4 years. I should never have done, if I offered to give you a particular account of all the trouble and vexation he gave me. I shall only mention 3 instances which crowned all the rest. On the 20th of November, i.e. a month after our fishermen set sail, while I was entertaining at supper some of the inhabitants, he came masked into my house with his servants and broke the glass windows, bottles, and drinking glasses, and threw down the tables, chairs, chest of drawers, and everything that came to hand. Before I had time to get into my chamber and take my pistols, this insolent mob disappeared very seasonably, for I would have loaded my pistols and pursued them if my guests had not hindered me. Next morning his servants fell upon mine, who expected nothing less than to be threshed to death with clubs. This second insult having provoked my patience to the last degree, I was meditating some revenge upon these assassins, when the Recollets came and remonstrated to me that I must disassemble my resentment to prevent any innovation in the king's affairs. Then I resolved to shut myself up and apply myself to study, to divert the vexatious thoughts of not being able to pull off my mask. The third trick which he played me at the end of 3 days was this. He sent to arrest 2 soldiers, whom I had employed to cut down some grass in the meadows, about half a league from the garrison. They were seized while they were mowing, bound and carried away prisoners, under the pretense of being deserters, because they had lain 2 nights out of the garrison without his leave, and, which would have proved yet more fatal to these innocent men, he had certainly caused them to be knocked on the head on purpose to vex me, if the Recollets and his own miss had not earnestly interceded on their behalf. After this accident, the Recollets advised me to go and see him, and to entreat him to put an end to all his persecutions, assuring him at the same time that I was entirely his servant and friend. Durus est hic sermo. Whatever reluctancy I had to yield to an advice so contrary to nature, which, I must confess, struggled furiously within me, yet I offered so much violence to myself that I submitted to it. I was at his house, went into his chamber, and being with him all alone, I spoke to him for a quarter of an hour in the most submissive terms that any slave could use. I am ashamed to make this confession to you, for I blush to myself every time I think of so mean a submission. However, instead of his listening to my reasons and treating friendly with me, he fell into a most furious passion, and loaded me with a torrent of most bitter reproaches. In this case, sir, I preferred the service of the king before the punctilios of honor, for I did nothing but retire to my own house, being well satisfied that I was not assassinated by his domesticks. But the disorder which this affair produced would require a long discourse. It will be more to the purpose to come to matter of fact. I do assure you that he would have laid me up if the inhabitants had appeared to be in his interest. He pretended that he had been insulted, and consequently that he was in the right of revenging himself, whatever it cost him. But the tragical end of a governor, whose throat was cut in this country about 30 or 40 years ago, furnished him with abundant matter of reflection. He judged it therefore his safest way to dissemble his anger, being persuaded that if I should have run him through with my sword, the soldiers and inhabitants would have favored my escape to the English in the neighborhood of Placentia. In the meantime, the Recollets, who had a mind to compose these growing differences, found no great trouble in reconciling us, for they remonstrated to him of what consequence it would be for us to live in a good correspondence and to avoid the troubles that would ensue upon our quarrels. This proposal of an accommodation was in appearance most agreeable to him, and so much the rather, because he was glad to dissemble his resentments by the external signs of friendship. So we saw and embraced one another with mutual protestations of forgetting all that had passed between us. After this reconciliation, I had reason to believe that his heart would not give the lie to his mouth, because I thought he was not so imprudent as to inform the court of some trifles, wherein he would appear to have prostituted his honor. But I was deceived, for he took the pains to add afterwards to the verbal process he had given in before our accommodation some falsehoods which he ought to have concealed. 'Tis needless to acquaint you how by chance his papers fell into my hands. That indiscretion might prove a disadvantage to some persons whom heaven bless. I shall only tell you that after the Recollets had seen and read the allegations contained in his papers, they'd made no scruple to advise me to take care of myself, and ingenuously declared to me that they never intended to meddle any more in that affair, because they perceived that they had innocently contributed to do me a prejudice by restoring peace between him and me. This wholesome advice made me perceive the danger to which I should be exposed if I continued any longer at Placentia, insomuch that the fear I had of being sent to the Bastille after the arrival of the ships from France made me resolve to abandon all hopes of making my fortune here and to throw up my places. After the inhabitants were acquainted with this news, all of them except 3 or 4 came running to my house to assure me they were ready to sign my verbal process in case I would change my resolution. But instead of accepting their offer, I gave them to understand, having thanked them first for their goodwill, that they would bring mischief upon themselves and be looked upon at court as seditious persons and disturbers of the public peace, since by a detestable principle of politics, an inferior person is always judged to be in the wrong, whatever reason he may have on his side. Indeed, I would gladly have avoided this fatal necessity of throwing up my places, which seemed insensibly to lead me to some great fortune. But at last, the confinement in the Bastille made such a deep impression upon my mind, after I had seriously reflected upon the troublesome circumstances of my affairs, that I made no scruple to embark in a little vessel, which was the only one, and the last that was to go to France. The proposal I made to the captain of presenting him with 1,000 crowns was so well received that he engaged to land me upon the coast of Portugal for that sum, upon condition that I should keep the secret. The best of the matter was that my enemy had used the precaution of writing to the governors of Belle Isle, of the Isle of Ré, and of Rochelle, to seize me as soon as I should land. He reckoned, and not without reason indeed, that this vessel would put into one of these 3 ports, but 300 pistols dexterously conveyed to the hands of some people that are not so much accustomed to finger gold have a wonderful effect, for that very sum, which indeed I was loth to part with, saved me my liberty, and perhaps my life. Pursuant to this resolution, I embarked the 14th of the last month, notwithstanding the risk that one runs by sailing in the wintertime through such a sea as lies between Newfoundland and France. 'Tis needless to inform you that I left at Placentia a great deal of household furniture, which I could neither sell nor carry off. 'Twill be more edifying for you to hear the journal of our voyage. We encountered 3 terrible storms in our passage without any damage, and in the last of these, which lasted 3 days, the wind at northwest, we run 150 leagues without any sail. This last storm was so violent that the seamen embraced and bid an eternal adieu to one another, for every minute they expected to be sunk without relief. As this storm alarmed us, so the contrary winds from the east and northeast that sprung upon us 100 leagues to the westward of Cape Finisterre occasioned an equal dread, for we were obliged to traverse the sea for 3 or 24 days, after which we descried the cape by virtue of our frequent tackings, and by a strange accident were attacked by a Flushing privateer, which could not board us, because the sea rolled so high, but contented herself with firing upon us, and that with so little effect that we did not lose one man. Our masts and rigging indeed was so damaged that after we were parted from the privateer, by the help of the night and a great fog, we could scarce make use of our sails. However, we refitted with all possible diligence, and the captain of the ship, having then a fair pretence to luff out of the direct course, stood to the southeast in the night time. This feigned course did not secure us from the privateer, which might happen to steer the same course, so that in the night time we put ourselves in a readiness to renew the fight in the daytime. In effect, he did not pursue us, as we apprehended, but about noon we escaped yet more narrowly, for we were pursued by a sallyman in sight of the coast for 4 hours, and were within a hair's breadth of being taken, before we got under the cannon of the fort of this city. Had we been catched, the governor of Placentia would have had some ground for the joyful exclamation, "Incidit in Silam," etc. But thank God we were only frighted. As soon as we came to an anchor, I paid down my 1,000 crowns to the captain, who has reason to look upon this action as one of the best he ever did in his lifetime. The longboat was no sooner in the water than I went ashore with all my baggage, and as soon as I came into the city, I procured ammunition and provisions for the ship with that expedition, that the captain weighed anchor the very next day, and so continued his course to France. As for the memoirs of the country of Canada, which you have so often desired, I have addressed them to the Rochelle merchant, who conveyed your letters to me all the while I was in Canada. To these I have tacked a small catalogue of the most necessary words of the Algonquin language, which, as I have often told you, is the finest and most universal language in that continent. If your nephew continues his design of undertaking a voyage to that country, I would advise him to learn these words in the time of his passage, that so he may be able to stay 5 or 6 months with the Algonquins and understand what they say. I have likewise sent you an explanation of the sea terms made use of in my letters. The making of this little table was a diversion to me in my voyage, for in pursuing my letters, I drew out some remarks which I designed to impart to you, if I find that the ensuing memoirs give you satisfaction. You will readily guess that from the year 1683 to this very day, I have renounced all manner of ties to my country. The curious adventures that I have related to you in writing since that time will undoubtedly afford an agreeable diversion to your friends, provided they are not of the number of those insufferable devotees who would rather be crucified than see an ecclesiastic exposed. Pray be so kind as to write to me to Lisbon, and inform me of what you hear in reference to my concern. You have such good correspondence at Paris that you cannot miss of knowing how things go. I doubt not but my adversary feeds himself with the hopes that his usual presence would procure the apprehending of me in France, where he thinks I would be the fool to land. But now to be sure he'll fret his heart out, for that he cannot gull me to his wishes. However, 'tis as much his interest to solicit my death, pursuant to his unjust charge against me, as 'tis my glory to procure him a long life. Upon this foot, sir, the longer he lives, the more revenge I shall have, and consequently I shall have an opportunity of an easy solace for the loss of my places, and the disgrace I have met with from the king. I am, sir, yours, etc.